The royal physician's hands trembled as he examined the newborn prince's face in the candlelit chamber of the royal Alcazar in Madrid. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life, and doom an empire that had ruled half the world for 3 centuries. The infant's jaw protruded so severely that his tongue hung from his mouth like a piece of raw meat, his lower teeth jutting forward in a grotesque underbite that made feeding impossible. But this wasn't just any baby. This was Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg ruler, and the living embodiment of a genetic nightmare that had been brewing in royal bloodlines for generations. The doctor knew what the courtiers whispered in the shadows of the palace corridors. They called it the Habsburg jaw, that distinctive, elongated, lower mandible that had become the family's grotesque trademark. But as he stared at this helpless infant, gasping for air through malformed passages, he realised something that would send chills through the Spanish court. This wasn't just deformity. This was extinction wearing a crown. What the physician couldn't have known was that he was witnessing the final chapter of one of history's most chilling genetic experiments. For over 200 years, the Habsburg dynasty had been conducting an unconscious but systematic breeding program that would make modern scientists recoil in horror. Brother married sister, uncle married niece, and cousin married cousin in an endless cycle of genetic Russian roulette. Each generation rolled the dice with DNA, and each generation lost a little more of their humanity. The baby prince before him represented the mathematical endpoint of this biological catastrophe. His family tree wasn't a tree at all. It was a knot, a twisted web where the same names appeared over and over again. Charles II had only 4 great-great-great-grandparents, instead of the normal 32. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents were first cousins. His genetic diversity was lower than that of the offspring of full siblings, but the jaw was just the beginning. As the physician would discover in the coming years, this child's body was a catalogue of genetic horrors. His oversized tongue would make speech nearly impossible. His malformed palate would prevent proper eating, and his reproductive organs would develop so poorly that producing an heir would become a biological impossibility. The most powerful monarchy in Europe was about to be brought to its knees not by armies or revolutions, but by the simple, inexorable mathematics of genetics. And yet, the true horror wasn't what had already happened to this innocent child lying in his golden crib. It was what his birth meant for the millions of subjects across Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and the vast Spanish colonies in the Americas. Because when Charles II inevitably died without an heir, his death would trigger a catastrophic war that would reshape the entire European continent and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The Habsburg jaw had become more than just a physical deformity. It had become a weapon of mass destruction, and the fuse had just been lit in a Spanish palace on a cold November night in 1661. But to understand how a simple genetic trait could topple an empire, we need to travel back to the snow-covered mountains of Austria in 1273, where a minor nobleman named Rudolf Habsburg first seized power in a moment that would echo through 7 centuries of European history. Rudolf had no idea that his decision to keep power within the family would eventually create a monster that would devour his own bloodline. The Habsburg strategy was brilliantly simple and catastrophically flawed. Marriage was warfare by other means. Instead of conquering territories with armies, they would acquire them through wedding ceremonies. Let others wage war became their motto. You, happy Austria, marry. Every royal marriage was a calculated political move designed to expand Habsburg influence across Europe. But there was a problem with this strategy that wouldn't become apparent for generations. Europe's royal families were already a tight-knit club. By the late medieval period, every crowned head could trace their lineage back to the same handful of noble families. When the Habsburgs began their systematic program of strategic marriages, they were unknowingly shrinking an already limited gene pool. Each political alliance through marriage was also a genetic time bomb, ticking quietly toward a biological disaster that no one could see coming. The first signs appeared innocuously enough. Rudolf's great-great-grandson, Frederick III, had a slightly prominent lower jaw. Nothing dramatic, just a subtle protrusion that gave him a determined, almost noble appearance. Court painters actually emphasized this feature, presenting it as a sign of Habsburg strength and character. The family wore their distinctive jaw with pride, never suspecting that what they saw as a mark of royal breeding was actually the first symptom of genetic breakdown. As generations passed, the Habsburg marriage web grew increasingly complex and disturbing. Frederick's son Maximilian I married Mary of Burgundy, bringing vast territories into the Habsburg fold, but also introducing new genetic complications. Their son Philip the Handsome married Joanna of Castile, and suddenly the Habsburgs found themselves ruling Spain. But Joanna carried her own genetic baggage, a history of mental illness that would plague the Spanish royal line for centuries. Philip and Joanna's son, Charles V, became the most powerful man in Europe, ruling an empire where the sun literally never set. His dominions stretched from Vienna to Seville, from the Netherlands to Naples, and across the Atlantic to Mexico and Peru. But even at the height of Habsburg power, the family curse was quietly strengthening. Charles V's jaw was more pronounced than his ancestors, and he struggled with a severe speech impediment that made public speaking torturous. The mathematics of royal marriage were working against the Habsburgs with ruthless efficiency. When Charles V's son Philip II married his first cousin Maria Manuela of Portugal, they were unknowingly combining identical genetic defects from both sides of their family tree. Their son Don Carlos was born with such severe physical and mental disabilities that he became a source of shame for the Spanish court. His jaw was so malformed that eating was painful, his spine was twisted, and his behaviour was so erratic that his own father eventually had him imprisoned. Philip II himself epitomised the Habsburg genetic crisis in ways that courtiers dared not speak aloud. His jaw jutted forward so dramatically that he couldn't properly close his mouth, causing him to drool constantly. Court protocol required that servants discreetly wipe his chin during public audiences. His oversized tongue made his speech slurred and difficult to understand, forcing him to communicate increasingly through written orders rather than verbal commands. But Philip II's personal struggles paled in comparison to the systematic genetic disaster he was orchestrating for future generations. After Maria Manuela's death, he married Mary I of England, his own aunt, in a desperate attempt to bring England into the Catholic Habsburg fold. When that marriage produced no children, he wed Elizabeth of Valois, a French princess who was actually his daughter's age. Finally, he married his own niece, Anna of Austria, in a union that would prove to be the most genetically catastrophic decision in European royal history. Philip II and Anna of Austria were uncle and niece, sharing 25% of their DNA, the same genetic relationship as half-siblings. When Anna became pregnant, courtiers whispered prayers that the child might escape the family curse. Instead, she gave birth to Philip III, a boy whose physical deformities were so severe that foreign ambassadors wrote shocked reports back to their home countries about the Spanish prince's appearance. Philip III's jaw protruded so far forward that his lower teeth extended beyond his upper lip, even when his mouth was closed. His tongue, swollen and oversized, made speech nearly impossible. Foreign diplomats reported that conversations with the future king required interpreters, not because of language barriers, but because his words were so garbled by his malformed mouth that even Spanish courtiers couldn't understand him. The genetic nightmare was accelerating with each generation, but the Habsburgs couldn't see it. To them, these marriages weren't biological experiments, they were political necessities. Every wedding ceremony was designed to keep power concentrated within the family, to prevent foreign dynasties from gaining footholds in Habsburg territories. They were trying to create a political fortress, but they were actually building a genetic prison from which their bloodline would never escape. And the most terrifying part was that the worst was yet to come. Philip III's reign marked the beginning of the Habsburg endgame, though no one at the Spanish court could have predicted how quickly their genetic house of cards would collapse. When the young king married his first cousin Margaret of Austria in 1599, the ceremony was celebrated throughout the Spanish Empire as a triumph of dynastic unity. The bride and groom shared the same great-grandparents, the same distinctive jaw, and the same doomed genetic destiny. Their wedding portraits, painted by the finest artists in Europe, reveal the tragic beauty of the Habsburg decline. Both Philip III and Margaret are depicted with their mouths carefully closed, their lower jaws subtly hidden by strategic poses and flowing garments. The painters understood what the royal couple could not, that these faces were becoming less human with each generation, shaped by forces beyond their control or comprehension. Margaret of Austria brought her own genetic horrors to the marriage. Her family tree was so intertwined with Habsburg bloodlines that tracing her ancestry became an exercise in mathematical absurdity. She was simultaneously Philip III's first cousin, his second cousin twice over, and his third cousin through multiple lineages. When geneticists centuries later attempted to calculate her coefficient of inbreeding, the numbers were so extreme that they initially assumed calculation errors. The couple's first child, Anne of Austria, was born in 1601 with deformities so severe that court physicians initially believed she might not survive infancy. Her jaw was so malformed that breastfeeding was impossible, requiring wet nurses to use specialised feeding devices just to keep her alive. But Anne's survival came at a terrible cost. She would grow up to become one of the most genetically compromised individuals in European history, a walking collection of hereditary diseases that would make her future marriage negotiations a diplomatic nightmare. Philip III himself was struggling with the mounting physical toll of his genetic heritage. By his 30s, his jaw had become so problematic that eating in public became a form of royal torture. Courtiers reported that mealtimes stretched for hours as the king struggled to chew and swallow food with his malformed bite. His speech had deteriorated to the point where only his closest advisors could interpret his words, creating a bizarre situation where the ruler of the world's largest empire could barely communicate with his own subjects. The king's mental state was equally compromised. Modern analysis of historical records suggests that Philip III suffered from severe cognitive impairment, possibly caused by the same genetic factors that deformed his physical features. He displayed classic signs of what we now recognise as developmental disabilities: difficulty with abstract thinking, problems with memory and concentration, and an almost childlike dependence on his advisors for even basic decisions. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Philip III's condition was his complete lack of awareness about the genetic catastrophe unfolding within his family. Court records show that he was genuinely puzzled by his children's health problems, apparently unable to connect their suffering to the centuries of intermarriage that had preceded their births. He consulted astrologers, commissioned religious ceremonies, and even brought in foreign physicians, all searching for explanations that lay hidden in his own family tree. The Spanish court had become a theatre of genetic horror, though the actors didn't understand the play they were performing. Courtiers developed elaborate protocols to hide the royal family's increasing disabilities from foreign visitors. Meals were served in private chambers to avoid the embarrassment of the king's eating difficulties. Public speeches were replaced with written proclamations read by court officials. Even religious ceremonies were modified to minimise the royal family's public appearances. Meanwhile, the Habsburg genetic web was spreading across Europe like a biological plague. Anne of Austria, despite her severe deformities, was married off to Louis XIII of France in 1615, carrying her toxic genetic heritage into the Bourbon bloodline. The marriage was a diplomatic triumph and a genetic disaster, producing children who suffered from the same jaw deformities and mental impairments that plagued their Spanish relatives. Philip III's son, Philip IV, represented the next step in the family's genetic descent into chaos. Born in 1605, he exhibited all the classic Habsburg features in even more extreme form. His jaw protruded so dramatically that contemporary portraits show him with his mouth perpetually hanging open, his oversized tongue visible even when he attempted to keep his lips closed. Foreign ambassadors wrote detailed reports describing their shock at the young prince's appearance, with one Venetian diplomat noting that the future king looked more monster than man. But Philip IV's physical deformities were only the beginning of his problems. Historical records suggest that he suffered from severe learning disabilities, requiring specially trained tutors who developed unique teaching methods to work around his cognitive limitations. Simple concepts that other children grasped intuitively had to be explained to Philip IV through repetitive drills and visual demonstrations. Even as an adult king, he would rely heavily on written instructions and visual aids to understand complex political situations. The tragedy of Philip IV's condition becomes even more heartbreaking when viewed through the lens of his royal responsibilities. This was a man who inherited control over territories spanning 4 continents, who commanded armies and navies across the globe, and who made decisions that affected millions of lives. Yet he possessed the mental capacity of a child and the physical limitations of someone suffering from severe genetic disorders. Philip IV's marriage in 1621 to Elizabeth of France, his first cousin and the daughter of the genetically compromised Anne of Austria, represented the final catastrophic mistake in the Habsburg breeding program. Elizabeth brought French Habsburg genes back into the Spanish line, creating a genetic perfect storm that would produce the most severely affected Habsburg heir in history. When Elizabeth became pregnant in 1629, court physicians and astrologers made elaborate predictions about the future heir. None of them could have imagined the biological nightmare that was growing in the Queen's womb. The child she was carrying would possess genetic damage so severe that modern scientists studying his remains would initially refuse to believe their findings. But that child would have to wait. Elizabeth's first pregnancy ended in tragedy when she gave birth to a daughter so deformed that she survived only a few hours. Court records, heavily censored by royal decree, mention only that the infant suffered from divine afflictions that made survival impossible. The true extent of the baby's deformities was considered too disturbing for official documentation. The pattern would repeat itself over and over again. Elizabeth would become pregnant 8 times, but only one of her children would survive to adulthood. A sickly daughter named Maria Theresa, who would carry the Habsburg genetic curse into the French royal family through her marriage to Louis XIV. The other pregnancies ended in miscarriages, stillbirths, or infants who died within days of birth, their bodies too damaged by genetic defects to sustain life. And then, in 1661, came the birth that would seal the Habsburg dynasty's fate forever. Elizabeth's final pregnancy produced a son who would inherit the Spanish throne and the full weight of 3 centuries of genetic mistakes. The child who would be crowned Charles II was about to become the living embodiment of humanity's most dangerous genetic experiment. The physician's trembling hands as he examined the newborn prince weren't just responding to the shock of what he saw. They were responding to the realization that he was witnessing the end of the world as he knew it. Charles II's childhood was a medical nightmare that unfolded behind the gilded walls of the Spanish royal palaces, hidden from public view but meticulously documented by court physicians who couldn't believe what they were witnessing. By age 3, the young prince had already undergone more medical interventions than most adults experience in a lifetime, yet his condition continued to deteriorate with each passing month. The king's jaw had grown so disproportionately large that his face appeared to be melting downward, as if gravity itself was pulling his features toward the earth. His lower mandible extended nearly 2 inches beyond his upper jaw, creating a cavern-like mouth that made eating solid food impossible. Court cooks were forced to develop entirely new techniques, creating liquid meals that could be poured directly down the prince's throat to bypass his inability to chew or properly swallow. But the feeding problems were just the beginning of Charles II's medical catastrophe. His oversized tongue, swollen to nearly twice normal size, made speech so garbled that even his own mother struggled to understand his attempts at communication. The Spanish court, once famous for its elaborate verbal ceremonies and poetic declarations, was forced to adapt to a future king who could barely produce intelligible sounds. Foreign diplomats visiting the Spanish court wrote increasingly alarmed reports back to their home countries about the heir to the throne. The Venetian ambassador described Charles II as a creature so deformed that one questions whether God intended him for this world or the next. The French envoy was even more direct, writing to Louis XIV that the Spanish prince appears to be more animal than human, with features so distorted that children flee at his approach. These weren't exaggerations born of diplomatic rivalry. Modern analysis of contemporary portraits and medical records reveals that Charles II suffered from a condition so severe that 20th century geneticists initially refused to believe the historical documentation. His coefficient of inbreeding was calculated at 0.254, higher than the offspring of full siblings, and approaching levels typically seen only in laboratory experiments with isolated animal populations. The Spanish court's attempts to hide the prince's condition became increasingly desperate and elaborate. Public appearances were carefully choreographed affairs, where Charles II would be positioned behind screens or curtains, with court officials speaking on his behalf. When foreign dignitaries insisted on meeting the future king face-to-face, elaborate theatrical productions were staged to minimise their exposure to his appearance and behaviour. Charles II's mental development was equally catastrophic. By age 10, he still couldn't read or write beyond the most basic level, despite having the finest tutors in Europe, working with him daily. His attention span was measured in minutes rather than hours, and he displayed behavioural patterns that modern psychologists would recognise as severe developmental disabilities. Court records describe episodes where the prince would spend hours staring at his own reflection, apparently fascinated by his distorted features. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Charles II's condition was his apparent awareness of his own abnormality. Historical accounts describe moments when the young prince would touch his protruding jaw and ask his caretakers why God had made him different from other people. These questions sent shockwaves through the Spanish court, where the official position was that royal blood made the Habsburgs superior to ordinary humans, not inferior. The genetic damage extended far beyond Charles II's visible deformities. Medical records reveal a catalogue of internal problems that would have killed most people before adulthood. His digestive system was so malformed that he suffered from chronic malnutrition despite having access to the finest foods in Europe. His immune system was so compromised that minor infections became life-threatening illnesses, requiring months of recovery. Even more alarming were the neurological problems that became apparent as Charles II entered adolescence. He suffered from seizures that court physicians described as divine visitations, not understanding that they were witnessing the effects of severe brain damage caused by genetic defects. During these episodes, the future king would lose consciousness, his malformed body convulsing while foam poured from his grotesquely oversized mouth. The Spanish nobles who were supposed to prepare Charles II for kingship found themselves facing an impossible task. How do you teach statecraft to someone who can't understand basic concepts? How do you prepare someone for diplomatic negotiations when they can't speak clearly enough to be understood? How do you train a military commander who lacks the physical coordination to mount a horse? Their solution was to create an elaborate system of royal puppetry. Charles II would be positioned on his throne during official ceremonies while hidden advisors whispered instructions in his ear. When foreign ambassadors presented their credentials, court officials would interpret the king's garbled responses and provide translations of his supposed royal wisdom. The entire Spanish government became a theatrical production designed to hide the fact that their king was essentially a child trapped in a grotesquely deformed adult body. But the most terrifying revelation was yet to come. As Charles II reached sexual maturity, court physicians made a discovery that would seal the Habsburg dynasty's fate forever. The same genetic defects that had deformed his face and damaged his mind had also devastated his reproductive system. The anatomical abnormalities were so severe that producing an heir would be biologically impossible. The Spanish court's desperate attempts to find Charles II a suitable wife became increasingly frantic and absurd. How do you arrange a marriage for someone whose genetic defects make procreation impossible? How do you negotiate a diplomatic alliance based on the promise of future heirs when you know those heirs can never exist? The answer was to lie. Elaborate deceptions were constructed to convince foreign royal families that Charles II was capable of producing children. Court physicians created false medical reports describing the king's supposed fertility. Diplomatic correspondence carefully avoided any direct discussion of the king's physical condition. The entire Spanish diplomatic corps became complicit in a massive fraud designed to hide the biological truth that the Habsburg line was already extinct. In 1679, Charles II married Marie-Louise d'Orléans, a French princess who was completely unprepared for the horror that awaited her in the Spanish court. Their wedding night became the stuff of whispered legend among European royalty, a catastrophic encounter between a terrified young woman and a genetically damaged man-child who possessed neither the physical capability nor the mental understanding necessary for intimate relations. Marie-Louise's letters to her family in France, heavily censored by Spanish authorities, hint at the nightmare of her married life. She described her husband as a creature of such peculiar construction that marital duties become impossible to contemplate, much less complete. Her requests to return to France became increasingly desperate, but diplomatic protocol trapped her in a marriage that was destroying her sanity. The Spanish court's obsession with producing an heir led to increasingly bizarre and disturbing interventions. Court physicians subjected Charles II to procedures that were essentially medieval torture, attempting to correct anatomical problems that were rooted in his genetic code. Religious ceremonies were performed to invoke divine intervention in the royal reproductive process. Astrologers calculated the most auspicious times for the king to attempt procreation, not understanding that the positions of the stars couldn't overcome the mathematics of genetics. Years passed without pregnancy, and the Spanish court's desperation reached fever pitch. Foreign physicians were secretly consulted, bringing exotic treatments and experimental procedures to the royal palace. Some of these cures were so dangerous that they nearly killed the already fragile king. Others were based on such primitive medical understanding that they actually made his condition worse. But nothing could change the fundamental biological reality that the Habsburg experiment had reached its mathematical conclusion. Charles II represented the ultimate expression of 3 centuries of genetic narrowing, a human being so genetically compromised that his body could no longer perform the basic functions necessary for species continuation. The king's complete inability to produce children wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a geopolitical catastrophe waiting to happen. Every major European power had been watching the Spanish succession question for decades, knowing that Charles II's death would trigger a massive continental war over who would inherit the vast Spanish Empire. And that war was coming sooner than anyone imagined, because Charles II's genetic damage was accelerating his physical decline at a terrifying pace. By 1690, Charles II's physical deterioration had accelerated to the point where Spanish court physicians were secretly preparing for his imminent death, even though the king was only 29 years old. His body, ravaged by the cumulative effects of centuries of genetic damage, was failing in ways that medieval medicine couldn't understand or treat. The king's jaw had continued growing throughout his 20s, reaching proportions that made eating increasingly dangerous. Court records describe meals that lasted 4 or 5 hours, with Charles II struggling to consume enough nutrition to keep his emaciated body alive. His weight had dropped to less than 90 pounds, giving him the appearance of a living skeleton draped in royal robes. Marie-Louise d'Orléans, trapped in her nightmarish marriage to the genetically damaged king, began showing signs of severe mental breakdown. Her correspondence with the French court, intercepted by Spanish intelligence, revealed a woman driven to the edge of sanity by her proximity to the Habsburg genetic catastrophe. She wrote of nightmares where she gave birth to monsters, of waking moments when she couldn't tell if her husband's deformed features were real or hallucinations brought on by stress and isolation. The Spanish court's attempts to maintain the fiction of royal normalcy became increasingly elaborate and desperate. When foreign diplomats requested audiences with the king, elaborate staging was required to present Charles II in the most favourable possible light. Specially designed throne chairs supported his weakened body, while strategically placed lighting and carefully chosen angles attempted to minimise the visual impact of his deformities. But the most chilling aspect of Charles II's condition was his growing awareness of his own genetic doom. Historical accounts describe moments when the king would stare at portraits of his Habsburg ancestors, tracing the progression of the family jaw through generations of paintings. Court observers reported that he seemed to understand, on some primitive level, that he was the final product of a biological experiment gone terribly wrong. The king's mental state was deteriorating as rapidly as his physical condition. He began experiencing what court physicians described as divine visions, almost certainly seizures caused by brain damage from his genetic defects. During these episodes, Charles II would speak in garbled tongues about apocalyptic futures and the end of dynasties, prophecies that terrified the Spanish court because they seemed to be coming true. Meanwhile, Marie-Louise's desperate situation reached a crisis point when she attempted to flee Spain and return to France. Spanish guards intercepted her carriage at the French border, dragging the screaming queen back to the royal palace in Madrid. The incident was officially described as a royal pilgrimage, but European diplomatic circles understood that the Queen of Spain had tried to escape her own marriage. The Spanish court's response to Marie-Louise's escape attempt revealed the true extent of their desperation. Rather than addressing the underlying problems in the royal marriage, they increased security around the Queen and began monitoring her correspondence even more closely. The palace became a prison designed to keep the terrible secret of Habsburg genetic failure hidden from the rest of Europe. Charles II's inability to produce children was no longer just a personal tragedy. it had become an international crisis. Every major European power was positioning itself for the inevitable war that would follow the Spanish king's death. The French were claiming that their Bourbon bloodline gave them rights to Spanish territories. The Austrians insisted that their Habsburg connections made them the natural successors. The English and Dutch were forming alliances to prevent either France or Austria from dominating Europe. But the most terrifying aspect of the approaching succession crisis was that it was entirely preventable. If the Habsburgs had simply married outside their immediate family for just 2 or 3 generations, the genetic damage could have been reversed. Instead, their obsession with keeping power within the bloodline had created a biological dead end that would trigger one of the most devastating wars in European history. The Spanish court's attempts to hide Charles II's condition became increasingly surreal. When the king appeared in public, teams of servants were positioned throughout the crowd to distract attention from his appearance and behaviour. Court artists were commissioned to create portraits that bore little resemblance to the king's actual features, presenting him as a normal-looking monarch, instead of the genetic catastrophe he had become. Religious authorities were brought in to provide spiritual explanations for the king's condition, developing elaborate theological justifications for why God might choose to test the Spanish royal family with such extreme physical and mental challenges. These explanations satisfied some courtiers, but they couldn't change the biological reality that the Habsburg line was genetically extinct. In 1689, Marie-Louise d'Orléans died suddenly at age 27, officially from food poisoning, but more likely from the psychological trauma of her marriage to Charles II. Her death eliminated the last theoretical possibility of a Habsburg heir, though Spanish court physicians knew that pregnancy had never been biologically possible, given the king's reproductive abnormalities. Charles II's reaction to his wife's death revealed the full extent of his mental deterioration. Court records describe him sitting motionless beside her coffin for days, apparently unable to understand that she was dead. When courtiers finally convinced him to leave the funeral chamber, he repeatedly asked when Marie-Louise would be returning, displaying the cognitive capacity of a confused child rather than a 30-year-old king. The search for a new wife for Charles II became one of the most cynical diplomatic exercises in European history. Spanish ambassadors travelled throughout Europe, attempting to find a princess willing to marry a man whose genetic defects were becoming increasingly difficult to hide. Most royal families politely declined, having heard whispered reports about the true condition of the Spanish king. Finally, in 1690, the Spanish court arranged a marriage between Charles II and Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess whose family was desperate enough for royal connections to overlook the Habsburg genetic disaster. The wedding ceremony was carefully choreographed to minimise Charles II's public exposure, with most of the event conducted in private chambers rather than in front of the traditional crowds of Spanish nobility. Maria Anna's first meeting with her new husband was described by court observers as one of the most shocking encounters in royal history. The German princess, expecting to meet a powerful European monarch, instead found herself face to face with what appeared to be a living corpse dressed in royal robes. Her screams echoed through the palace corridors, audible to servants and guards throughout the royal complex. The new queen's attempts to fulfill her marital duties became the subject of whispered conversations throughout the Spanish court. Court physicians were forced to intervene repeatedly, providing medical assistance for what should have been natural, intimate relations. The Spanish royal bedchamber became a medical facility, equipped with specialised devices and staffed by physicians who understood that the king's reproductive abnormalities made normal marital relations impossible. But even more disturbing was the growing realisation that Charles II's genetic damage was affecting his ability to make rational decisions about governing his vast empire. Foreign ambassadors reported that conversations with the Spanish king were becoming increasingly incoherent, with Charles II apparently unable to understand basic diplomatic concepts or remember previous discussions. The Spanish Empire, stretching from Madrid to Manila, was being governed by a man whose cognitive abilities had been destroyed by genetic defects. Military commanders in distant provinces were making crucial decisions without royal input, because the king couldn't understand the situations they were describing. Colonial administrators were operating with increasing independence, because communications from Madrid had become unintelligible. And then, in 1698, something happened that would transform the Habsburg genetic catastrophe from a Spanish problem into a global crisis. Charles II, in one of his few moments of apparent lucidity, made a decision that would reshape the entire balance of power in Europe and trigger a war that would cost millions of lives. The king's final act would prove that genetic destruction could be just as devastating as any military weapon ever created. On a fog-shrouded morning in October 1700, Charles II summoned what remained of his failing strength to perform the final act of his genetically cursed reign. The 39-year-old king, his body ravaged by 4 decades of progressive genetic deterioration, could barely hold a quill pen as he prepared to sign the document that would plunge Europe into its bloodiest conflict in generations. The will of Charles II wasn't just a legal document, it was a genetic bomb with a delayed fuse, crafted by a mind so damaged by centuries of Habsburg inbreeding that its author couldn't fully comprehend the catastrophic consequences of his decision. In his grotesquely malformed hand, the last Habsburg king of Spain was about to write the death warrant for hundreds of thousands of European soldiers. The Spanish court had spent months desperately trying to influence Charles II's succession decision, but the king's cognitive impairment made normal diplomatic pressure impossible. His attention span lasted mere minutes. His memory was so damaged that he forgot conversations within hours, and his speech was so garbled that even his closest advisors struggled to understand his intentions. How do you conduct delicate political negotiations with someone whose brain has been destroyed by genetic defects? The answer was to manipulate him like a child, which is essentially what Charles II had become. French agents, led by the brilliant and ruthless Cardinal Portocarrero, spent years carefully conditioning the Spanish king to favour French succession claims. They used simple, repetitive messages, visual aids, and emotional manipulation techniques that would have been appropriate for a mentally disabled child rather than the ruler of a global empire. Meanwhile, Austrian Habsburg representatives were conducting their own campaign of influence, reminding Charles II of his family connections to the Vienna branch of the dynasty. But their approach was too sophisticated for the king's damaged cognitive abilities. They presented complex genealogical arguments and detailed legal precedents that Charles II simply couldn't process or remember. The French strategy proved more effective because it was designed for someone with severe intellectual disabilities. They created simple visual family trees showing Philip of Anjou, Louis XIV's grandson, as Charles II's great-nephew. They arranged for the young French prince to visit Spain, knowing that Charles II responded better to personal encounters than abstract concepts. Most importantly, they convinced the Spanish king that naming a French heir would keep the Spanish Empire united, appealing to his one remaining coherent desire to preserve his territories intact. But the true tragedy of Charles II's final decision wasn't the choice itself. It was that he made it while completely unaware of its implications. Court observers reported that the king seemed to believe he was simply naming a successor for the Spanish throne, not triggering a continental war. His damaged mind couldn't grasp that every major European power had been preparing for this moment for decades, positioning armies and forming alliances in anticipation of his death. The physical act of signing the will became a grotesque spectacle that horrified even the Spanish courtiers, who had grown accustomed to their king's condition. Charles II's hands shook so violently that he could barely control the pen, leaving ink blots and shaky scratches across the parchment. His oversized jaw made it impossible to keep his mouth closed, causing saliva to drip onto the documents as he worked. The scene looked more like a medieval torture session than a royal ceremony. Foreign ambassadors who witnessed the signing later wrote detailed accounts that revealed their shock at the Spanish king's appearance and behaviour. The Venetian envoy described Charles II as a living corpse who moves only through divine intervention, while the Dutch representative reported that the king appeared to be more dead than alive, sustained only by the momentum of habit and the whispered instructions of his handlers. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the will signing was Charles II's apparent satisfaction with his decision. Court records indicate that after completing the document, the king smiled, a horrifying expression given his malformed features, and announced that he had secured Spain's future. He had no understanding that he had actually guaranteed Spain's destruction, setting in motion a conflict that would devastate the very territories he thought he was protecting. The will's contents, when they became public after Charles II's death, sent shockwaves throughout European diplomatic circles. The Spanish king had named Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his sole heir to the entire Spanish Empire. This meant that the vast Spanish territories in Europe, the Americas, and Asia would all pass under French Bourbon control, creating a Franco-Spanish superpower that would dominate the world. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, leader of the Austrian Habsburgs, declared the will invalid and announced his own claim to Spanish territories. The English and Dutch, terrified of French domination, began mobilizing their armies and navies. Even smaller European powers started choosing sides, understanding that the coming conflict would reshape the entire continental balance of power. But the most tragic irony was that Charles II lived long enough to witness the beginning of the chaos he had unleashed. In his final weeks, as reports arrived of armies mobilizing across Europe, the dying king seemed to develop moments of clarity about what he had done. Court physicians reported that he repeatedly asked whether the soldiers were coming, apparently sensing that his decision had triggered military preparations throughout the continent. Charles II's death throes were as grotesque as his life had been. His jaw had become so enlarged that he could no longer close his mouth at all, leaving his oversized tongue permanently visible and making speech completely impossible. His body weight had dropped below 80 pounds, giving him the appearance of a skeleton wrapped in royal robes. His eyes, once described as the only normal feature in his malformed face, had become clouded and unfocused, suggesting that brain damage was accelerating in his final days. The Spanish court's attempts to maintain royal dignity during Charles II's final illness became increasingly surreal. Elaborate ceremonies were conducted around the dying king's bed, with courtiers pretending that his garbled moans were coherent royal proclamations. Foreign ambassadors were still being scheduled for audiences with a man who could no longer recognise faces or understand spoken words. On November 1st, 1700, Charles II of Spain died at the Royal Alcazar in Madrid, his genetically damaged body finally succumbing to 4 decades of progressive biological failure. With his death, the Spanish Habsburg line became extinct, ending one of the most powerful dynasties in European history, not through military defeat or political revolution, but through the simple mathematics of genetics. But the king's death was just the beginning of the catastrophe his genetic condition had created. Within weeks of Charles II's funeral, the War of the Spanish Succession exploded across Europe like a continental wildfire. French armies marched into Spanish territories, Austrian forces mobilised to contest French claims, and English fleets began blockading Spanish ports. The genetic curse of the Habsburg jaw was about to claim victims on battlefields from Madrid to Manila. The war would rage for 13 years, consuming the lives of over 400,000 soldiers and countless civilians. Entire regions would be devastated, cities would be burned to the ground, and families would be torn apart by a conflict that originated in the bedchamber of a genetically damaged Spanish king. The Habsburg jaw had become history's most expensive medical condition, paid for not in gold, but in human blood. And yet the most horrifying realization was still to come. The final tally of destruction caused by the Habsburg genetic experiment would take decades to calculate, but by 1714, when the Treaty of Utrecht finally ended the War of the Spanish Succession, the scope of the catastrophe was becoming clear. Over 400,000 soldiers had died in battles that stretched from Flanders to Italy to Spain itself. Entire cities had been destroyed, economies had collapsed, and the political map of Europe had been redrawn, all because a genetically damaged king had made a decision his malformed brain couldn't fully comprehend. But the war casualties were just the most visible cost of 3 centuries of Habsburg inbreeding. Modern genetic analysis reveals that the dynasty's systematic program of cousin marriages had created biological damage that extended far beyond Charles II's obvious deformities. Medical historians examining the records of Habsburg family members from 1550 to 1700 have identified patterns of genetic disorders that would make contemporary scientists recoil in horror. The Habsburg family tree, when mapped by modern geneticists, resembles less a tree than a genetic traffic accident. The same names appear over and over again as ancestors, creating what researchers call genetic loops that compress the family's hereditary diversity to levels normally seen only in laboratory experiments with isolated animal populations. By Charles II's generation, the Spanish Habsburgs had less genetic diversity than the offspring of full siblings. The mathematical probability of the specific combination of genetic defects that created Charles II's condition approaches statistical impossibility under normal circumstances. His malformed jaw, oversized tongue, reproductive abnormalities, cognitive impairment, and immune system deficiencies represented the convergence of multiple recessive genetic disorders that could only occur through systematic inbreeding over many generations. Modern medical analysis of Charles II's preserved remains, conducted by Spanish researchers in the 1980s, revealed anatomical abnormalities so severe that the initial findings were classified as state secrets. The king's jawbones showed growth patterns that suggested severe developmental disorders, while dental analysis revealed bite patterns that would have made normal eating impossible. Even more disturbing were signs of cranial abnormalities that indicated significant brain malformation. The genetic damage extended throughout the Habsburg family line in ways that weren't visible to 17th century observers. Miscarriage rates among Habsburg women were extraordinarily high, with many pregnancies ending in stillbirths or infant deaths. The few children who survived often displayed subtler forms of the same genetic problems that reached their extreme expression in Charles II. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was that the Habsburg genetic crisis wasn't unique. Similar patterns of genetic deterioration can be identified in other European royal families that practiced extensive intermarriage. The Ptolemies of ancient Egypt, who married siblings for over 3 centuries, eventually produced rulers so genetically damaged that they couldn't govern effectively. The royal families of ancient Persia experienced similar genetic collapse after generations of cousin marriages. The Habsburg experiment had essentially replicated these historical genetic disasters on a much larger scale, with consequences that extended far beyond the royal family itself. When Charles II's genetic damage triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, it demonstrated how individual biological failures could cascade into geopolitical catastrophes affecting millions of people. The irony of the Habsburg genetic crisis becomes even more profound when viewed through the lens of their original motivations. The dynasty had pursued intermarriage as a strategy to concentrate power and preserve royal blood purity. Instead, they had systematically destroyed their own biological viability while creating political instability that ultimately cost them their empire. Modern genetic counselors studying the Habsburg case use it as a textbook example of the dangers of consanguineous marriage. The mathematical probability calculations show that Charles II's parents, who were uncle and niece, had a 25% chance of producing children with severe genetic disorders. When that risk is compounded over multiple generations of similar marriages, the probability of genetic catastrophe approaches certainty. The Spanish territories that Charles II thought he was protecting through his succession decision were ultimately fragmented and distributed among multiple European powers. The Spanish Netherlands went to Austria, Gibraltar was ceded to Britain, and various Italian territories were redistributed among different dynasties. The unified Spanish Empire that the Habsburgs had spent centuries building was dismantled within a generation of Charles II's death. Even more tragically, the genetic problems that destroyed the Spanish Habsburg line didn't disappear with Charles II's death. The same hereditary defects were carried into other royal families through strategic marriages, spreading Habsburg genetic damage throughout European nobility. The famous Habsburg jaw can still be identified in portraits of various European aristocrats well into the 19th century. The scientific revolution that was beginning to emerge during Charles II's lifetime would eventually provide explanations for the biological disaster that had befallen his family. But the Habsburg rulers couldn't benefit from genetic knowledge that wouldn't be discovered for another 2 centuries. They were conducting a massive biological experiment without understanding the basic principles of heredity or the mathematical probabilities involved in genetic inheritance. The final lesson of the Habsburg genetic catastrophe extends far beyond European royal history. It demonstrates how seemingly private family decisions can have enormous public consequences, how biological failures can trigger political disasters, and how genetic problems can cascade across generations with devastating cumulative effects. Charles II of Spain died believing he had preserved his empire and secured his dynasty's future. Instead, his genetically damaged decision-making had triggered the destruction of everything the Habsburgs had built over 3 centuries. The jaw that had been worn as a badge of royal pride had become the instrument of dynastic extinction, proving that genetics can be just as decisive as politics in shaping human history. The Habsburg jaw had indeed ended a dynasty, but its effects extended far beyond a single royal family. It had reshaped the balance of power in Europe, triggered one of history's most devastating wars, and provided a cautionary tale about the dangers of genetic isolation that would echo through centuries of scientific research. In the end, the most powerful empire in 16th century Europe had been brought down not by armies or revolutions, but by the simple mathematics of genetics and the inexorable logic of biological inheritance. The Habsburg experiment had proven that royal blood, rather than being superior to common blood, could become fatally compromised through the very practices that were supposed to preserve its purity. And somewhere in the genetic code of European nobility, the Habsburg jaw continues to echo through the centuries, a permanent reminder of humanity's most expensive lesson in hereditary science. Think about the profound irony of what you've just discovered. The Habsburg dynasty, which controlled territories spanning 4 continents and commanded the wealth of entire civilizations, was ultimately destroyed not by foreign armies or popular revolutions, but by something as simple as choosing the wrong marriage partners. Their obsession with keeping power within the family created a genetic time bomb that ticked quietly for generations before exploding with devastating force. The physicians examining baby Charles II in that Madrid palace couldn't have known they were witnessing the beginning of a continental catastrophe. But you now understand what they couldn't, that genetics can be just as decisive as politics in shaping human destiny. The Habsburg jaw wasn't just a medical curiosity, it was a weapon of mass destruction that would claim over 400,000 lives in the War of the Spanish Succession and reshape the entire balance of power in Europe. But here's what makes this story truly terrifying for our modern world. The same genetic principles that destroyed the Habsburgs are still operating today. Isolated populations around the globe are unknowingly conducting similar genetic experiments, concentrating the same hereditary defects that created Charles II's nightmare existence. The mathematics of genetic inheritance haven't changed, only our understanding of them has improved. If you enjoyed diving into this incredible piece of history, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps me continue making these deep dives into the most fascinating stories from the past. The royal physician's trembling hands as he examined Charles II weren't just responding to the horror of what he saw, they were responding to the realization that he was holding the future of Europe in his arms. And that future was genetically doomed. Now you understand why those hands were shaking, and why the Habsburg jaw became the most expensive medical condition in human history.